Hello, so this is your presentation on evidence-based practice. So we're going to start with a definition. So probably the most commonly used definition is that from Sackett et al., and that is that evidence-based practice is the conscientious, explicit and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions. So ideas about knowledge and knowledge creation are fundamental to understanding evidence-based practice. So if we think about the two opposing paradigms within research, it starts to help us understand some of these debates. So one paradigm is called positivism, and positivists believe that reality can be discovered and measured, that the world is ordered, and that we will eventually, with good quality research, scientific research, understand the world. So positivists advocate experimental research, quantitative methods, large-scale studies and randomized control trials. These are the kind of gold standard of this positivist approach. So the aim is to predict human behaviour, to look for hard rules and laws about the world with the assumption that any problem can be solved. So we can see that this positivist school very much resonates with modernism. So this idea of using scientific inquiry to understand social issues with a view to developing a grand narrative. Conversely, you have the interpretivist paradigm, and interpretivists believe that people are not just puppets, that individuals have independence and free will, and that we can improve our understanding of the world through interpreting the meanings humans attach to their actions. So interpretivist research advocates qualitative studies, smaller scale studies, that seek to understand the meaning that people attach to their actions. So interpretivism, I guess, resonates more with postmodernist thought, and recognises, in terms of if we think about some of those tensions within social work, that people and relationships are very complex, as opposed to positivists who are seeking certainty. So this debate about social work as a science or as an art is quite fundamental to ideas about knowledge creation. So interpretivist research would suggest there's no right answer, but you can understand better the factors that you might have to take into account within your practice. Whereas positivists would suggest that we, through good quality research, can uncover the best intervention to use at any one time, and we can predict the outcome of that intervention. Okay, so now on to the why. So there's been some criticism of social work for being woolly-minded and prone to bias, suggesting that practitioners might just choose those interventions that they like, as opposed to thinking about what's going to be most effective for each circumstance. So really the arguments for evidence-based practice seek to address this. So there's this idea of accountability to the people we work with, to the profession, and also to the taxpayer. That we need to reduce this bias and improve outcomes for the people that we work with, and in that way we will deliver more ethical practice. So there's a whole range of arguments why evidence-based practice is helpful to social work. But I guess next we need to think about how do you deliver it? And I guess the first thing to say is that so Malcolm Payne highlights there are two possible approaches to evidence-based practice. The first is the principle that evidence should determine how social work should be provided and organised, so a kind of top-down approach. So it might be that you work in an organisation that has scrutinised the evidence and decided that they will implement a particular approach with their particular client group. The second is a system of practice in which individual practitioners, together with their clients, evaluate the most effective methods to help with the problems they face. So now we're going to think a little bit more about this individual level of practice, so a sort of bottom-up approach. And I'm going to start with looking at the 5 steps of evidence-based practice as advocated by Eileen Gambrell and others. So these 5 steps begin with formulating a practice question. So Gambrell suggests that information needs to be converted into answerable questions. These questions should be stated specifically enough to guide a computer search, concern the client's welfare, relate to a problem that has some chance of solution, and ideally formed in collaboration with the client. A well-formed question describes the client, course of action, alternative courses of action, and the intended result. The second step is to track down with maximum efficiency the best evidence with which to answer the question. So this requires electronic access to bibliographic databases and skill in searching them efficiently and quickly enough to guide practice. The third step is to critically appraise the evidence for its validity and usefulness. So this entails applying a hierarchy of evidence relevant to the question or evidence types. So this is where you get into this idea of, what's the gold standard in terms of evidence, and generally at the top of that hierarchy you will find systematic reviews and randomised controlled trials at the top, and then you can work down from that. The fourth step is to apply the results of this appraisal to practice decisions. So this requires deciding whether the evidence applies to the decision at hand based on whether a client is similar enough to those studied, access to interventions described in the literature, and weighing possible outcomes relative to concerns such as numbers needed to treat practical matters and client preferences. And the final stage is to evaluate the outcome. So this may entail record keeping, including single case designs. So it's this idea that actually each practitioner has a responsibility to evaluate each piece of work that they engage in order to build their own evidence base for their practice. Okay, so next I would like to highlight the assumptions underpinning evidence-based practice. So the first is that evidence can indeed be found to inform practice. The principle that underpins that is that you need to find the evidence as a practitioner. The second assumption is that certain evidence is stronger or better than others. We've touched on that previously. This is this idea that you have to critically appraise the evidence. The third is that the effectiveness of interventions can be established, so then it's your role to identify the most effective intervention. And finally, that interventions can be replicated. So that's your responsibility to implement the most effective intervention. So these are the assumptions and the principles underpinning evidence-based practice. Okay, so I'd now like to talk about evidence-informed practice. And this is seen as a term which leaves ample room for the constructive and imaginative judgment and knowledge of practitioners and clients, that actually research findings should not take precedence. So that actually this language is seen as being a bit more inclusive of these other elements of practice and good effective practice, so that practice might be enriched by prior research but not limited to it. So many prefer this term because it moves us away from this idea of kind of formulaic ways of practicing. And many say that an interpretive conception of evidence enables practitioners to be less dependent on or restricted by a hierarchy of evidence in which randomised controlled trials are at the top and qualitative inquiries at the bottom, because actually what we know from research is that the therapeutic alliance is the single most important therapeutic common factor, rather than the theory or the intervention used. So that's a really interesting point to finish off with, I think, in terms of evidence-based practice. And I'm just going to highlight the reference list for today so you can follow up on that. Okay, so this is your reference list for the session today. So your set text is on there, the Modern Social Work Theory book by Malcolm Payne. It's not a whole chapter, but it's a good section in the book about evidence-based practice that explores those debates. And the book underneath, Gray and Webb, Social Work Theories and Methods, has a whole chapter by Plath that I referenced in the presentation as well. Thank you.